September afternoon had settled over St. Mary Mead with the golden contentment of a cat in sunshine. The annual harvest festival spread across the village green like a patchwork quilt of human endeavour. Stalls displaying prize marrows and perfect dahlias, children with sticky fingers pursuing escaped balloons, and the gentle competition of neighbours who had known each other's gardens and secrets for decades. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the spreading oak that had witnessed 70 years of such festivals, her knitting needles moving with the quiet efficiency of long practice. Her pale blue eyes, deceptively mild behind wire-rimmed spectacles, observed the familiar tableau with the attention of someone who understood that human nature reveals itself most clearly in moments of supposed celebration. At the centre of the green, Silas Grimsby's butcher stall commanded attention through sheer force of personality. Grimsby himself was a man built like his own prize beef, solid, substantial, and impossible to ignore. His voice, carrying easily across the green as he haggled with customers, had the boom of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Behind his wooden counter, polished brass scales caught the afternoon light, their gleaming weights arranged with military precision. "Finest lamb in the county, Mrs. Hartwell," Grimsby declared, his meaty hands gesturing expansively. "Raised on my own pastures, fed on sweet grass and morning dew. These scales don't lie. A pound is a pound when Silas Grimsby does the weighing." Mrs. Hartwell, a woman whose pinched expression suggested she found fault with most things on principle, examined the joint with suspicious eyes. "Your prices have certainly grown with your reputation, Mr. Grimsby. Perhaps your scales are more generous to your profits than to your customers." Grimsby's laugh was hearty, but his eyes remained calculating. "Now, Mrs. Hartwell, you know I've never given short weight in my life. These brass beauties have been in my family 3 generations. My grandfather's grandfather cast them himself. They're more honest than most people, I'd venture." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. She had noticed that Tom Fletcher, Grimsby's young apprentice, had winced at his master's words. The boy stood slightly apart from the main activity, his thin frame tense with what might have been nervousness or something deeper. His left hand, she observed, bore fresh bandaging around the thumb, an occupational hazard in the butchering trade, no doubt, but the way he kept the hand partially hidden suggested embarrassment or perhaps guilt. Near the scales, Doctor, Haydock was examining a particularly fine ham with professional interest. "You've done well with this one, Grimsby." "The curing is excellent. Reminds me of what old Patterson used to produce." "Better than Patterson ever managed," Grimsby replied with characteristic modesty. "Modern methods, Doctor. Science applied to an ancient craft. These old-fashioned folk resist progress, but results speak for themselves." This pronouncement drew a sharp look from Colonel Melchett, who had been sampling the local cider with evident approval. The Colonel's military bearing remained rigid despite his retirement, and his disapproval of Grimsby's attitude toward village traditions was well known. "Some things, Grimsby, improve with age and experience rather than innovation," the Colonel observed dryly. "Your grandfather's scales, for instance, have served honestly for decades without requiring modern methods." Miss Marple noticed that several villagers had begun to gather around this exchange, drawn by the promise of conflict. Mrs. Price from the bakery stood with her arms folded, her expression suggesting she had opinions to share. Beside her, young Simon Blake, the artist who had recently rented the cottage near the church, sketched rapidly in a small notebook, apparently finding the scene worthy of artistic attention. The tension might have escalated, but Reverend Clement chose that moment to approach with his usual diplomatic smile. "Gentlemen, surely on such a beautiful day we can appreciate both tradition and progress. Mr. Grimsby's success speaks well for our village, just as our time-honoured customs bind us together as a community." Grimsby's response was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, who swept up to the stall with the determined air of someone on a mission. "Silas, I need your best joint for Sunday dinner. The Weatherbys are coming, and you know how particular they are about their meat." As Grimsby turned to serve this important customer, Miss Marple observed the subtle dynamics playing out around the stall. Tom Fletcher had moved closer to the scales, his good hand hovering near the brass weights, as if he wanted to touch them, but didn't dare. Dr. Haydock was studying the boy with the clinical attention he usually reserved for patients. Most intriguingly, she noticed that someone had recently polished the weights to an unusual brilliance, all except the 2-pound weight, which bore a small crescent-shaped scratch that caught the light differently from its companions. The afternoon wore on with the comfortable rhythm of village life. Children chased hoops between the stalls, the brass band from Much Benham played familiar tunes with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and the gentle competition for prizes continued. Miss Marple finished her row and began another, her mind cataloguing the small tensions and relationships that formed the invisible web connecting every soul present. It was nearly 4 o'clock when Tom Fletcher's scream shattered the peaceful afternoon. The sound was thin and high, cutting through conversations and music like a blade through silk. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting to see the boy standing frozen behind the butcher's counter, his face white as butcher's paper, his bandaged hand pointing at something behind. The stall. The brass band faltered to a discordant halt. Conversations died mid-sentence. In the sudden silence, Tom's voice came again, smaller now but carrying clearly across the green. "He's dead. Mr. Grimsby is dead." Dr. Haydock reached the stall first, his medical bag already in hand. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the unhurried grace of someone who understood that haste rarely improved tragic situations. As she approached, she could see Grimsby's substantial form slumped behind his counter, his head resting at an unnatural angle against his precious brass scales. The 2-pound weight, the one with the crescent scratch, lay beside his temple, its polished surface now dulled with something darker than tarnish. "Nobody touch anything, Doctor," Haydock commanded, his voice carrying the authority of medical training and natural leadership. "Tom, step away from there. Colonel, perhaps you could telephone Inspector Slack." As the village green erupted into shocked whispers and urgent activity, Miss Marple stood quietly at the edge of the gathering crowd. Her mild eyes took in every detail: the position of the body, the scattered weights, the way Tom Fletcher's bandaged thumb was trembling, and most particularly, the fact that the brass scales themselves remained perfectly balanced, despite the violence that had occurred beside them. Human nature, she reflected, was rather like those scales, capable of perfect balance until disturbed by forces that upset the careful equilibrium. Someone had added a weight to one side of Silas Grimsby's life, and the scales had finally tipped toward death. The harvest festival was over, but Miss Marple suspected the real gathering of clues, motives, and hidden truths was just beginning. The shock that had frozen the harvest festival like a photograph suddenly shattered into motion and sound. Voices rose in fragments: terrible, poor man, murder, before coalescing into the urgent whispers that spread through Saint. Mary Mead like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Miss Marple remained beneath the oak tree, her knitting needles resuming their quiet rhythm as she observed the familiar patterns of human behaviour that tragedy always revealed. Some villagers pressed closer to the cordoned stall, drawn by morbid curiosity, while others retreated as if proximity to violence might somehow contaminate their ordered lives. Mrs. Hartwell had positioned herself strategically near the cake stall, close enough to observe everything while maintaining an air of respectful concern. "I always said there was something not quite right about that man," she declared, her voice carrying with remarkable clarity despite its conspiratorial tone. "Too successful too quickly, if you ask me. And those scales of his always claimed they were honest, but I've thought for years there was something off about them. You'd watch the pointer settle just to the left, yet he'd call it exact. One hardly likes to make a fuss, but I told Mrs. Price only last week that I wouldn't be surprised if something came of it." Mrs. Price, still flour-dusted from her morning's baking, bristled with defensive loyalty to village commerce. "Now, Mrs. Hartwell, if there was anything wrong with scales in this village, mister, Pritchard would know. He keeps the ironmongery and would see to repairs. Besides, Silas had his weights inspected regularly. He told me so when I delivered the breakfast rolls." "He told you many things," Colonel Melchett observed dryly, his military bearing rigid with disapproval. "Facts, however, are considerably thinner on the ground. The man made enemies. That's not in dispute. My groom parted company with him over a disputed ham last Christmas. Called it outright cheating. The mention of disputes drew more voices to the growing chorus of grievances. Albert Mace, the elderly church groundskeeper, emerged from the gathering shadows with the weathered face of a man nursing long-held resentments. "Pleasant enough if you had money to spend," he muttered. "Different story if you couldn't afford his fancy prices. Ask Mrs. Pemberton how pleasant he was when she couldn't settle her account last winter." This reference to the village's most vulnerable widow drew uncomfortable glances. Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly as she filed away this detail, alongside others accumulating in her orderly mind. Inspector Slack's arrival brought temporary order to the chaos. The inspector, a man whose efficiency was matched only by his impatience with village complexities, surveyed the scene with the brisk authority of someone eager to wrap up what appeared straightforward. "Right then," Slack announced after conferring briefly with Dr. Haydock. Heavy brass weight, substantial blow to the head, apprentice found the body. "We'll need statements from everyone, but this shouldn't take long to sort out." Tom Fletcher sat on an overturned crate near the church wall, his face buried in his hands while Reverend Clement offered quiet comfort. The boy's distress seemed genuine, but Miss Marple noticed how his shoulders shook with what might have been sobs, or something else entirely. More tellingly, his good hand kept moving to his jacket pocket, checking that something remained safely there. "The lad's taking it hard," Colonel Melchett observed, following her gaze. "Natural enough, finding your employer like that." "Especially someone who'd been having difficulties with said employer," Mrs. Price added, with the satisfaction of sharing particularly choice gossip. "My niece at the post office mentioned seeing Tom yesterday morning, posting a letter with such a worried expression. Thick envelope, too, looked official." Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the scene with clinical attention, looked up sharply. "Official correspondence? That's interesting. Tom's not one for letter writing, from what I've observed." Young Simon Blake approached. From the crowd's margin, his artist's notebook still in hand and an apologetic smile playing about his lips. "I was sketching the scales when it happened," he offered. "The light was particularly good on the brass. I can't say I saw much. One gets lost in the work. But I do remember a lady's hat, blue with a feather, just at the edge of the awning. It bobbed rather distinctively." "Feathers," Miss Marple murmured to no one in particular, "are sometimes more helpful than one might think." Mr. Pritchard, the ironmonger, had appeared with the quiet efficiency of a man who hears his trade mentioned from considerable distance. "Not the scales themselves that worry me," he said gravely. "The weights. Silas brought them in 3 weeks ago, asking about polishing. I warned him to mind the stamps, crown and year marks from weights and measures. Polish too, enthusiastically, and you can take metal off without noticing." His expression deepened into professional concern. "That would make them light. Not honest, as you might say." Mrs. Hartwell's eyes gleamed with vindication. "There, you see." Inspector Slack had been examining the scattered detritus around the stool. String, pencil, apple core, sawdust, when he picked up the 2-pound weight with its distinctive crescent scratch. Family heirlooms, these were supposed to be. 3 generations of honest weighing. He set it down carefully, his gaze moving to Tom Fletcher. "You were in the best position to deliver force quickly, without being noticed." The statement hung in the air like a blade. Tom's hands twisted together as he looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "I didn't. I swear it. He wasn't always bad. Could be fair when the mood took him. He was teaching me proper curing, said I had a knack. Why would I?" "Because people do desperate things when cornered," Inspector Slack replied matter-of-factly. "And young men in particular don't always think clearly about consequences." Miss Marple rose from her bench with unhurried grace, gathering her knitting as the evening light began to fade. Around her, the village continued its dissection of Silas Grimsby's character and relationships, each revelation adding another weight to the scales of suspicion. But she had noticed something else, a small detail that others had missed in their eagerness to find obvious answers. The brass scales themselves remained perfectly balanced despite the violence that had occurred beside them. Rather like people, she reflected, who maintained their equilibrium when watched, but revealed their true nature only when they believed themselves unobserved. Someone had already tipped these particular scales toward murder, and finding the real weight behind that tipping would require looking far beyond the obvious. The harvest festival was over, But the real gathering of secrets, motives, and hidden truths was just beginning. By evening, the festival green had emptied, save for the official cordon and the lingering scent of trampled grass and spilled cider. Inspector Slack had commandeered the church hall for formal statements, where Reverend Clement's tea service and the echoing acoustics lent gravity to every spoken word. Miss Marple had positioned herself near the serving hatch with her knitting, ostensibly to provide calm hands and sensible assistance should anyone require comfort. It was a role that often proved remarkably illuminating, for people who might bristle at an inspector's direct questions would chatter quite naturally to an elderly lady who appeared absorbed in counting stitches. Inspector Slack began with Tom Fletcher, the boy's rigid posture betraying the shock that had settled into his bones. His bandaged left thumb remained pressed close to his palm, as he answered with the careful precision of someone who believed simplicity might serve as protection. "I took the orders while Mr." Grimsby did the cutting, Tom explained, his voice steady but hollow. "He sent me to fetch more ice from the storage shed near the trees. Said the lamb was getting too warm in the afternoon heat. I was away perhaps 10 minutes, no more. When I returned, he was as you found him." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. The ice shed stood at the far end of the green, a considerable distance from the butcher's stall where a perfectly adequate ice chest sat behind the counter. It seemed curious that the methodical Silas Grimsby would send his apprentice on such an inefficient errand, particularly with a bandaged hand that would make carrying ice awkward. More intriguingly, she observed Tom's right hand making its habitual journey to his jacket pocket, patting something square and substantial before withdrawing. Mrs. Price's mention of the thick envelope posted yesterday morning took on greater significance when viewed alongside this nervous gesture. Mrs. Bantry swept into the hall next, her indignation at the entire affair radiating from her magnificent bearing. "I stood directly in front of the stall," she declared. Silas was quite himself, arrogant as always about his prices. He'd had the audacity to reserve the last sirloin for Mrs. Weatherby, without her even appearing at the festival. When I turned to leave after ordering my lamb, I noticed nothing unusual whatsoever. "Your hat, Mrs. Bantry?" Inspector Slack inquired, consulting his notes. "Cherries, Inspector." "I cannot abide feathers in September. They molt something dreadful." Miss Marple filed this detail carefully away. Young Simon Blake had mentioned a distinctive blue hat with a feather, but Dolly Bantry's modest straw bore only fabric cherries. Someone else had worn the blue plumage that caught an artist's observant eye. Mr. Pritchard followed, his professional precision evident in every word. "I warned him about over-polishing those weights 3 weeks ago. 'Mind the crown stamps,' I told him. 'Polish too,' enthusiastically, 'and you'll take metal off the surface. Make them run light.' He said he'd always done his own polishing, family tradition and all that. But you can tell when someone's overdone it. The surface goes soft at the edges." This testimony struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. Through the open hall door she could see the brass scales still gleaming under their protective awning, the late light catching their carefully balanced pans. Even in the aftermath of violence they maintained their precise equilibrium with almost prim determination. During a brief recess, Miss Marple slipped outside under the pretence of retrieving a dropped knitting needle. Her mild eyes registered details that made themselves known to those who thought to seek them. The sharp scent of metal polish, far too recent for 3 weeks past, a tiny smear of whitish paste caught in the crescent scratch on the 2-pound weight, and most tellingly, a bright filament the colour of a kingfisher's breast clinging to the awning cord, not thread, but the unmistakable barb of a small feather. She also noticed something paper-thin wedged beneath the scale's wooden base, where it met the trestle. With the lightest touch she extracted a sweet wrapper, folded as tightly as a child's secret. Rather than keep it, that would be both silly and wrong, she smoothed it flat and called the constable's attention to it, suggesting in her mildest voice that Inspector Slack might find it of interest. Returning to the hall, she encountered Dr. Haydock, who spoke in low, respectful tones. "Single blow, considerable force. The angle is peculiar, lower than I'd expect from a tall man standing, almost as if the victim turned towards someone he didn't fear, or perhaps was struck while bending forward." "Fear does remarkable things to posture," Miss Marple observed gently. "Though I wonder if Mr." Grimsby might have turned towards someone offering something he valued, perhaps his vanity or his sense of importance. As the evening wore on, more details emerged from the villagers' testimonies. Mrs. Price mentioned Tom's recent change in routine, arriving later for his morning roll and paying with silver instead of his usual copper coins. Albert Mace spoke bitterly of Grimsby's treatment of Mrs. Pemberton, the struggling widow who had fallen behind on her account. Most intriguingly, Simon Blake elaborated on his observation of the blue hat. The movement was quite deliberate, he explained, not the random drift of someone browsing, but purposeful positioning. The wearer seemed intent on maintaining a specific angle to the stall, always keeping to the shadowed area beneath the awning. As Inspector Slack concluded the preliminary questioning, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to depart. Her mind was already organising the evening's revelations into patterns that might eventually illuminate the truth. Someone among these familiar faces had committed murder with careful deliberation, not desperate impulse. The evidence suggested planning, patience, and an intimate knowledge of both Silas Grimsby's habits and his precious scales. The harvest festival decorations remained in place, their cheerful colours now incongruous against the sombre reality of violence. Miss Marple reflected that scales, whether brass or moral, required honest weights to function properly. Tomorrow she would begin the delicate process of separating truth from deception, one carefully measured observation at a time. Morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage as she watched Constable Reeves escort Tom Fletcher along the lane toward the police station. The young man's shoulders sagged beneath his oversized coat, and he glanced once toward the church spire as if seeking comfort from its familiar presence. Inspector Slack's motor car waited with the patient authority of official business, its engine ticking softly in the morning air. Miss Marple set down her watering can and considered how readily people accepted tidy explanations when faced with untidy realities. Inspector Slack, she had observed, possessed the particular confidence that came from believing in simple solutions to complex problems. By mid-morning, the inspector had assembled his case with the methodical precision of a man who valued efficiency above subtlety. In the church hall, now serving as an impromptu headquarters, he presented his evidence to Colonel Melchett with the satisfaction of someone who believed the pieces fit together perfectly. "Clear opportunity," Slack declared, consulting his notebook. Fletcher was alone with Grimsby for extended periods. He admits to leaving the stall on this mysterious ice errand, convenient alibi for someone planning murder. The angle of the blow matches someone of his height, striking downward at a man examining his scales. Miss Marple, who had arrived ostensibly to arrange flowers but remained to listen, observed quietly, "Sent for ice by Mr. Grimsby, wasn't he? Rather different from choosing to leave, I should think." Slack waved this distinction aside. The motives become clearer too. "We've examined that thick envelope he posted yesterday. Application to a butcher's college in Gloucester. Expensive proposition for an apprentice on low wages. Desperate young men do desperate things when they need money quickly." Dr. Haydock, who had joined them, frowned slightly. The wound was clean and powerful, suggesting familiarity with the weapon. But Grimsby was likely bending forward when struck, examining his scales perhaps, or reaching for something. The village had divided itself along predictable lines regarding Tom's guilt. At Mrs. Price's bakery, the morning's customers offered their theories with the certainty that came from long acquaintance with gossip. Mrs. Hartwell proclaimed she had always found something shifty about the boy's quiet manner, while others recalled his gentle treatment of customers and his obvious dedication to learning the trade. "Saw him working late many evenings," offered Mr. Pritchard from the ironmongery. "Learning proper techniques, asking questions about different cuts. Seems odd behaviour for someone planning to leave his position." Miss Marple made her own quiet inquiries throughout the morning, her mild manner encouraging confidences that might have been withheld from official questioners. At Mrs. Pemberton's cottage behind the church, she discovered a detail that cast Tom's character in an entirely different light. The struggling widow produced a crumpled receipt with trembling fingers. "My arrears with Mr. Grimsby, 7 shillings 10 pence. Someone paid it yesterday morning, all in silver coins. When I asked who'd done such kindness, Silas turned cross about it, as if charity to me were an offence to his dignity." "And you think it was Tom?" Mrs. Pemberton nodded, her eyes bright with grateful tears. He always slipped me bits of suet for my boy's boots. Yesterday, he looked proper sick when I came in to thank him, white about the gills and couldn't meet my eyes. That's not the behaviour of someone planning murder, is it, miss? This revelation troubled Miss Marple considerably. A young man who spent his carefully saved silver on an elderly widow's debt seemed unlikely to commit murder for financial gain. When she later encountered Tom at the police station under Reverend Clement's spiritual guidance, her suspicions were further confirmed. The boy produced his most treasured possession, a dog-eared savings stamp book, thick with carefully pasted stamps and bound with ribbon to prevent the corners from fraying. "I keep thinking they'll say I stole it," he whispered, "but I didn't. I saved it one stamp at a time for the college fees." His story emerged in fragments: the scholarship application that represented his hope for advancement, the charitable payment that had depleted his savings, and his genuine bewilderment at Grimsby's decision to send him for ice when the existing chest was perfectly adequate. "He'd never have sent me away if it weren't necessary," Tom insisted. He was particular about efficiency. Wasted motion made him angry. During her afternoon walk, Miss Marple examined the cordoned crime scene with the attention she might give to a complex knitting pattern. The brass scales maintained their perfect balance despite the violence that had occurred beside them, their polished surfaces catching the light with almost defiant brilliance. The 2-pound weight with its distinctive crescent scratch lay where Inspector Slack had replaced it after examination. Miss Marple noted the whitish residue still clinging to the scratch's edges, not the brassy gleam of metal polish, but something with a different texture entirely. More significantly, the weight's current position created a slight imbalance that the obsessively precise Silas Grimsby would never have tolerated. Someone had indeed tipped these scales toward murder, but Miss Marple suspected the real weight behind that tipping remained carefully hidden. Inspector Slack's case against Tom Fletcher was built upon assumptions rather than evidence, circumstance rather than proof. As evening approached, she reflected that scales, whether brass or moral, required honest weights to function properly. Tomorrow she would begin the delicate process of separating truth from convenient fiction, one carefully measured observation at a time. The morning light held that peculiar September clarity that seemed to sharpen every detail, as though the day itself demanded precise observation. Miss Marple had positioned herself strategically in her front garden, ostensibly tending to her late roses while maintaining an excellent view of the cordoned butcher's stall where Mr. Pritchard was conducting his examination of the brass weights. The ironmonger moved with the methodical care of someone who understood that precision mattered in his trade. From his leather satchel he produced a velvet-lined box containing his own certified weights, brass standards, bearing the clear crown stamps and inspector's marks that guaranteed their accuracy. "Curious findings, Miss Marple," Pritchard called softly as she approached the garden fence, her knitting providing the perfect excuse for lingering. "Inspector Slack asked me to verify these weights against proper standards, and most of them are exactly as they should be after 3 generations of honest service." He lifted the familiar 2-pound weight, with its distinctive crescent scratch, placing it carefully in one pan of his portable scales while positioning his certified standard in the other. The beam settled, trembled momentarily, then tipped decisively toward his standard weight. "This one's running light," Pritchard announced with professional gravity, "nearly 2 ounces under proper measure." "Now, brass doesn't simply evaporate, Miss Marple, and these weights haven't seen enough honest wear to account for such loss." Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythm. "Someone has tampered with it deliberately." "Cleverly done too," Pritchard replied, turning the weight to reveal its base. "The work's been done from underneath, where it sits against the scale pan. You'd never notice unless you were looking specifically for such deception. Then they've filled the hollow with something white, that whiting paste you mentioned seeing in the scratch, to maintain the appearance of solid brass." The significance struck Miss Marple immediately. And this would affect the accuracy of Mr. Grimsby's weighing? Considerably. Using a light weight means giving customers more than they're paying for. Over months, that represents substantial loss of profit. Pritchard's expression darkened with professional disapproval. Someone wanted Silas Grimsby to lose money, without realizing why his accounts weren't balancing. This revelation transformed Missy Marple's understanding of the crime entirely. Here was not the desperate impulse of a young man seeking quick advancement, but the calculated malice of someone with both technical knowledge and patient determination to destroy Grimsby's livelihood gradually. Inspector Slack, when presented with this evidence, seemed less impressed than the discovery warranted. Interesting, certainly, but it doesn't alter the fundamental facts. Fletcher handled those weights daily. If anyone could have made such modifications without detection, it would be the apprentice. But the skill required, Miss Marple ventured gently, surely suggests considerable experience in metalwork, and the patience to execute such a plan over time. Young men learn quickly when motivated by greed, Slack replied dismissively. Besides, we've found the file used for the work, hidden in Fletcher's toolkit behind the stall. Rather careless of him to leave such evidence lying about. This convenient discovery troubled Miss Marple considerably. In her extensive experience with human nature, guilty parties rarely left incriminating evidence in such obvious locations, particularly when they had demonstrated the sophistication to plan elaborate sabotage. The planted file felt like misdirection, designed to support a predetermined conclusion. During her afternoon constitutional, she reflected on the morning's revelations. The tampered weight represented months of careful planning. Someone had systematically undermined Grimsby's business, while maintaining the appearance of his cherished family scales. This was not crime born of sudden desperation, but of deep-seated malice that had festered over considerable time. The whiting paste she had observed earlier now made perfect sense. Not merely polish residue, but deliberate concealment of criminal tampering. Someone had wanted Grimsby's scales to appear honest while functioning dishonestly, creating financial pressure that might eventually force him from business entirely. More significantly, this sabotage suggested intimate knowledge of weights and measures, access to proper tools, an understanding of how such deception might remain undetected. Tom Fletcher, despite his daily familiarity with the scales, lacked both the technical expertise and the calculating patience such a scheme required. As evening shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple considered how scales, like human relationships, required proper balance to function correctly. Someone had deliberately upset that balance through months of careful manipulation, then used the resulting chaos to commit murder. The real weight behind this crime remained carefully hidden, but she was beginning to understand that the brass scales themselves had been both weapon and victim in a far more complex scheme than Inspector Slack imagined. The discovery of the tampered weight had unsettled the village's comfortable assumptions, creating ripples that disturbed, secrets long buried beneath St. Mary Mead's placid surface. Miss Marple found herself the recipient of confidences that villagers seemed compelled to share, as though the revelation of deliberate sabotage had loosened tongues previously bound by discretion. Mrs. Price arrived at her cottage that evening with fresh scones, and an expression suggesting weightier matters than baking occupied her thoughts. "I've been thinking about what Mr. Pritchard discovered," she began, settling into the chintz armchair with the air of someone preparing for significant revelations. That sort of metalwork requires proper tools and considerable skill. It's not something one learns casually. Miss Marple poured tea with unhurried grace, understanding that patience often yielded more valuable information than direct questioning. Indeed, the precision suggests considerable expertise. Which brings me to something I perhaps should have mentioned earlier, Mrs. Price continued, her voice dropping to confidential tones. My late husband's brother worked as a foundryman before the war, knew all about casting and metal modification. He taught those skills to his son before consumption took him. That son being Albert Mace, who's worked around the village these 30 years, with access to every building and considerable grievance against those he considers his betters. This intelligence struck Miss Marple as highly significant. Albert Mace possessed both the technical knowledge and the bitter resentment that might drive such elaborate revenge. His comments about Grimsby's treatment of the poor had carried the weight of personal experience rather than mere observation. Albert's been struggling financially since his wife's illness, Mrs. Price added. Doctors' bills and medicines cost more than a groundskeeper's wages can cover. He approached Grimsby last winter about extending credit for meat, offering to work extra hours in payment. Grimsby refused quite publicly, saying he wasn't a charitable institution. The following morning brought revelations from an unexpected quarter. Miss Marple encountered Dolly Bantry at Gossington Hall, where Mrs. Bantry was wrestling with chrysanthemums and the inconvenience of murder disrupting her social arrangements. "My dear Jane, the most awkward thing," Dolly declared. "Lydia Crane has been quite beside herself all week. There's been trouble over the South Meadow lease. Silas held it from the Weatherby estate at favourable terms, but the agent threatened an increase. There was an awful scene in the lane with Silas swearing he'd sink them all before he'd pay. Lydia heard everything. She handles all the estate correspondence and takes such matters personally." "Miss Crane was at the festival, I believe?" "Oh, yes. Wearing her new blue felt with the kingfisher feather. Very smart. Bought in much Benham only last fortnight. She was quite particular about the sirloin order for the Weatherbys' Sunday dinner. The blue hat mystery began to crystallize. Miss Marple recalled young Simon Blake's observation about the deliberate positioning, the careful avoidance of clear sight lines. Someone had worn that distinctive hat while monitoring Grimsby's stall with calculated precision. Her afternoon inquiries led to Mr. Pritchard's ironmongery, where she found him examining a small dish of whitish powder. "Artist's gesso," he explained, noting her interest. "Young Blake orders it regular-like for his painting. Same consistency as what we found in that tampered weight, compacted and smooth, not rough like ordinary whiting." This connection to Simon Blake troubled Miss Marple, though she couldn't quite place why. The young artist seemed genuinely fond of Tom Fletcher, yet he possessed both the technical materials and the observational skills that might serve a more sinister purpose. At the church, Reverend Clement provided another piece of the puzzle. "Grimsby consulted me recently about what he called the ethics of collection," the vicar explained with obvious distaste. "There was a woman concerned. He considered himself a sort of benefactor with rights attached. I could not approve of his attitude." "Rights attached," Miss Marple murmured. Such a tidy phrase for untidy arrangements. The pattern emerging troubled her considerably. Grimsby had wielded financial pressure like a weapon, creating desperation among those least able to resist. Albert Mace with his sick wife and foundryman's skills. Miss Crane caught between estate duties and personal conscience. Even young Blake, dependent on patronage for his artistic career. Evening brought Dr. Haydock with medical observations that further complicated matters. "I've reconsidered the angle of that fatal blow," he explained. Grimsby was likely examining his scales when struck, bent forward, completely absorbed. The killer approached from behind, using intimate knowledge of sightlines and crowd patterns. Someone who'd observed the stall carefully over time? Precisely. This wasn't opportunistic violence, but calculated positioning by someone who understood both Grimsby's habits and the festival's rhythms. As darkness settled over the village, Miss Marple reflected on the web of resentments that had ensnared Silas Grimsby. The tampered weight represented months of patient sabotage, designed to destroy his livelihood gradually. The blue hat suggested careful reconnaissance, deliberate concealment of identity. Most troubling, the planted file in Tom's toolkit indicated someone willing to sacrifice an innocent youth to protect themselves. She sat by her window, knitting needles clicking softly as she considered the delicate balance that governed village life. Someone had been systematically disturbing that equilibrium for months, creating conditions that made murder seem like a logical conclusion to a carefully orchestrated campaign of destruction. The brass scales might maintain their perfect balance, but the moral scales of Saint. Mary Mead had been tipped decisively toward darkness. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, she was certain. Murderers who planned so carefully rarely stopped at a single deception. They continued adjusting the weights until they achieved the balance they desired, even if that meant adding more violence to tip the scales conclusively in their favour. The morning brought an unseasonable chill that seemed to settle over Saint. Mary Mead like a physical manifestation of the village's unease. Miss Marple, rising earlier than usual due to a restless night, spent considering the implications of tampered weights and hidden grudges, discovered the source of her intuitive discomfort when she observed Constable Reeves hurrying past her cottage toward the village green with the urgent gait of someone bearing unwelcome news. By the time she arrived at the scene, a small crowd had already gathered around the butcher's stall, their hushed conversations creating an atmosphere of barely contained anxiety. The brass scales, those proud symbols of 3 generations of honest weighing, lay in carefully arranged pieces beside their overturned trestle. The sight struck Miss Marple as oddly theatrical, too deliberate in its destruction to represent genuine vandalism, yet too violent to suggest accident. Inspector Slack surveyed the damage with the grim satisfaction of someone whose theories were being confirmed by events. "Deliberate sabotage," he announced to the assembled villagers. "Someone broke through the police cordon during the night and systematically destroyed the primary evidence. This suggests desperation. Our murderer knows we're closing in and is attempting to eliminate proof of their guilt." Dr. Haydock crouched beside the scattered components, his medical training extending naturally to precise observation of the damage patterns. "Curious methodology," he noted, lifting the main beam to examine its breakpoint. This wasn't random destruction. The beam has been deliberately weakened at its thinnest point, then snapped with calculated force. The brass pans show no damage whatsoever. They've been carefully removed and set aside before the breaking began. This observation struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. Someone had taken considerable care to destroy the scale's functionality while preserving their essential components. The brass beauties that had served the Grimsby family for generations had been treated with surprising respect by their supposed destroyer. Albert Mace approached the wreckage with his groundskeeper's tools and the weary expression of someone accustomed to cleaning up after others' destructive impulses. His weathered hands moved over the damaged beam with practiced familiarity, testing the breakpoint with the confidence of someone who understood metal fatigue and structural weakness. "Professional work," he muttered, more to himself than to the gathered crowd. Whoever did, this knew exactly where to apply pressure. These old beams have stress points from decades of use. You'd need to understand the metal's grain to find them so precisely. Young Simon Blake had arrived with his artist's materials, apparently intending to continue his sketching series, but stood frozen at the edge of the crowd with obvious distress. His notebook hung forgotten in his paint-stained hands as he stared at the destruction with what appeared to be genuine grief. "Such beautiful craftsmanship," he murmured, approaching the damaged scales with the reverence of someone who appreciated fine workmanship. The patina on that brass took decades to develop. Even if they could be repaired, they'd never look the same. Miss Marple noticed that his emotional response seemed entirely authentic, lacking the calculated quality she had observed in some of the previous day's testimonies. More significantly, she observed that his hands, while bearing the usual stains of his artistic work, showed no evidence of the metal filings or brass residue that would inevitably result from such destructive work. Lydia Crane arrived breathlessly, her usual administrative composure shaken by the morning's developments. She wore a different hat today, a simple brown felt that bore no resemblance to the distinctive blue creation with its kingfisher feather. Her gloved hands trembled slightly as she examined the damage, and Miss Marple noted that the gloves themselves were spotlessly clean, showing no trace of the metallic dust that clung to Albert's fingers. "This is terrible," Lydia declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing crises. "Those scales were historical artifacts. The Weights and Measures Inspector certified them only last year as authentic examples of 19th century craftsmanship." Inspector Slack had begun examining the area around the destroyed scales when Constable Reeves called attention to something wedged beneath the overturned trestle. "Looks like fabric, sir." Blue material caught on the wooden corner. The scrap was small but distinctive, fine felt material with an unmistakable iridescent quality that caught the morning light. Miss Marple recognized it immediately as matching the description of the blue hat that had been observed during the festival, though she noted that the fabric appeared to have been deliberately placed rather than accidentally snagged. "More planted evidence," she murmured quietly to Dr. Haydock, who had moved to examine the fabric scrap with clinical attention. "Indeed," the doctor replied in equally low tones. "Rather convenient, isn't it? Our saboteur seems determined to implicate everyone except themselves." Mr. Pritchard arrived with his professional tools and the grave expression of someone whose expertise was being called upon to assess damage to precision instruments. His examination of the broken beam confirmed Albert's assessment, while adding troubling details. "The breakpoint shows file marks," he announced after careful inspection with his magnifying lens. "Someone weakened the beam systematically over time, then applied final pressure to complete the break." This wasn't a single night's work. It represents weeks of careful preparation. This revelation transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the incident entirely. The destruction of the scales hadn't been a desperate response to the investigation's progress, but rather the culmination of a long-planned campaign of sabotage. Someone had been systematically undermining both Silas Grimsby's livelihood and the physical evidence of their crime for considerable time. More significantly, the technical expertise required pointed towards someone with intimate knowledge of metallurgy and structural engineering. The precise location of the file marks suggested familiarity not just with metalworking in general, but with these specific scales and their particular vulnerabilities. As the morning progressed and the crowd gradually dispersed, Miss Marple remained beside the damaged stall, her knitting providing the perfect excuse for lingering observation. She noticed that the wooden trestle bore fresh scratches that hadn't been present the previous day. Not random damage, but deliberate markings that formed a pattern she couldn't quite decipher. Most intriguingly, she discovered a small paper fragment wedged beneath the trestle's base, part of a label that read, "Selway & Company, Artist Colours, Much Benham." The fragment was clean and unwrinkled, suggesting it had been placed recently rather than accumulating over time. The second incident had indeed revealed the killer's growing desperation, but not in the way Inspector Slack imagined. Rather than destroying evidence, the saboteur had actually provided additional clues to their identity and methods. The careful protection of the brass components, the professional knowledge of structural weaknesses, and the continued pattern of planted evidence all pointed towards someone who valued craftsmanship while possessing the technical skills to destroy it systematically. As she walked home through the crisp morning air, Miss Marple reflected that scales, whether brass or moral, revealed their true nature most clearly when subjected to pressure. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to apply just the right amount of pressure to expose the truth that lay hidden beneath layers of deception and misdirection. The morning following the scale's destruction found Miss Marple in contemplative mood, her knitting needles moving with the measured rhythm of someone whose mind was occupied with weightier matters than wool. The saboteur's desperation had revealed more than they intended, providing additional clues that pointed toward a specific individual with both the technical knowledge and psychological profile necessary for such elaborate deception. She decided that a direct confrontation would be premature and potentially dangerous. Instead, she would arrange what she described to Mrs. Bantry as a small gathering to discuss the village's response to recent tragic events. In reality, she intended to conduct a careful psychological test that would allow the murderer to reveal themselves through their own reactions and knowledge. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, her cottage sitting room had been transformed into an intimate theatre of investigation. The brass pans from the destroyed scales rested on her sideboard under a clean linen cloth, their polished surfaces catching the firelight like golden witnesses to the truth she sought. Her carefully selected guests had assembled with the mixture of curiosity and obligation that characterized village social gatherings. Albert Mace sat near the window with his weathered cap in hand, clearly uncomfortable but unable to refuse Miss Marple's gentle insistence. His foundry-trained eyes kept drifting toward the brass pans with professional interest, and she noticed the faint scent of metal polish still clinging to his work clothes. Lydia Crane had arrived precisely on time, her administrative efficiency evident in her crisp movements, though she wore a simple brown felt hat, rather than her distinctive blue creation with its kingfisher feather. Simon Blake occupied the corner chair with his ever-present sketchbook, though his usual artistic absorption seemed forced and distracted. His hands, Miss Marple observed, showed the characteristic stains of his artistic work, but none of the metallic residue that would result from tampering with brass weights. Most tellingly, Mr. Pritchard had brought his professional tools and a selection of certified weights, ostensibly to demonstrate proper calibration techniques. "I've asked you all here," Miss Marple began with characteristic gentle authority, "because the destruction of those beautiful scales represents a loss to our entire community. 3 generations of honest service reduced to broken metal through someone's calculated malice." She moved to Pritchard's display with unhurried grace, lifting the 2-pound standard weight with its clear crown markings. "Mr. Pritchard has been kind enough to explain how these precision instruments function. The balance depends entirely on honest weights, Any deception in their construction renders the entire system unreliable. Albert Mace shifted uncomfortably, his foundry-trained expertise evident in his response. My father cast weights like those before the foundries went modern. Proper brass, properly marked, built to last generations. Takes real skill to modify them without leaving obvious traces. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, setting down the standard and lifting a small dish containing the whitish powder that had concealed the tampering. Someone clearly understood both metallurgy and the properties of artists' gesso well enough to create a perfect deception over many months. Simon Blake's pencil paused mid-stroke, his artistic eye drawn to the material with professional interest. Gesso requires specific preparation for different applications, he offered. The consistency must be precisely controlled. Too thick, and it becomes obvious. Too thin, and it fails to conceal underlying damage. His technical explanation was accurate, but contained more detail than casual familiarity would provide. Miss Marple filed this observation alongside others accumulating in her orderly mind, noting that his sketchpad now showed only abstract patterns rather than his usual architectural studies. The psychological pressure of maintaining such elaborate deception over months must have been considerable, she observed, watching each face carefully. Planning the sabotage, executing it gradually, then committing murder when financial pressure alone proved insufficient to drive Mr. Grimsby from business. Lydia Crane consulted her pocket watch with characteristic efficiency. Such speculation seems rather morbid for afternoon tea, Miss Marple. Surely Inspector Slack's investigation will resolve these matters through proper evidence. Oh, quite right, Miss Marple agreed mildly, then lifted the linen cloth to reveal the brass pans in their full golden glory. Though I confess myself fascinated by the care taken to preserve these beautiful components. Even in destruction, someone showed remarkable appreciation for fine craftsmanship. The reaction she had been waiting for came as a sharp intake of breath from Simon Blake, whose artist's sensibilities were genuinely moved by the scale's beauty. But more significantly, she observed the telltale tightening of gloved hands and the quick, involuntary glance toward the window, reactions that spoke of intimate knowledge rather than casual observation. "Before we conclude," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if you might help me understand something troubling." The precision of the tampering suggests someone who understood not just metalworking, but these specific scales, construction and vulnerabilities. Someone who had observed them carefully over considerable time. She paused, allowing her mild gaze to rest on each guest in turn. More intriguingly, the blue felt fragment found at the scene came from a hat with a distinctive kingfisher feather, rather specific millinery that would be easily remembered by an observant artist. Simon Blake's sketching stopped entirely, his pencil frozen as he stared at the brass pans with dawning comprehension. His glance toward Lydia Crane carried a complex mixture of understanding and horror, as if a terrible truth had suddenly revealed itself through Miss Marple's careful probing. But it was another guest entirely whose reaction provided the final confirmation Miss Marple required. The involuntary movement of hands checking for telltale residue, the professional assessment of the scale's construction, and most damning, the expert knowledge displayed in seemingly casual comments, all pointed towards someone whose technical expertise and patient malice had orchestrated months of careful sabotage. As the gathering dispersed into the evening shadows, Miss Marple remained by her window, knitting needles resuming their quiet rhythm. The psychological test had yielded exactly the results she had anticipated, confirming suspicions that had been building through careful observation of human nature under pressure. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, but tonight she would prepare her evidence with the same methodical precision the murderer had used to plan their elaborate deception. The scales of justice required honest weights, and Miss Marple intended to provide them with mathematical certainty. The morning after her carefully orchestrated gathering brought an unseasonable chill that seemed to settle into Miss Marple's very bones. She had observed the reaction she sought, but translating private certainty into public revelation required the delicate precision of a surgeon, or perhaps more aptly, the methodical accuracy of someone who understood how scales functioned when proper weights were finally applied. Inspector Slack arrived promptly at 9, his efficiency tempered by the grudging respect he had developed for Miss Marple's seemingly innocent observations that invariably proved devastatingly accurate. "Another of your theories, Miss Marple?" he inquired. though his tone lacked its usual dismissiveness. "Not a theory, Inspector," she replied gently, settling into her chair with knitting that seemed to require unusual attention. "Rather a pattern that has become quite clear, like a complex stitch when one finally understands the sequence. The murderer has been revealing themselves through their own expertise, much as a craftsman's work bears his distinctive marks." She had arranged for Mr. Pritchard to arrive first, ostensibly to discuss the possibility of repairing the damaged scales. The ironmonger entered with professional tools and the bearing of someone whose technical knowledge was both his pride and, Miss Marple suspected, his undoing. Soon after, the others arrived as if drawn by invisible threads. Lydia Crane with her administrative precision, Albert Mace with his foundry-trained hands, and young Simon Blake carrying his ever-present sketchbook. "Mr. Pritchard," Miss Marple began with characteristic mildness, "yesterday you mentioned that the tampering was done from underneath where it sits against the scale pan. Such specific knowledge suggests intimate familiarity with these particular scales' construction." The ironmonger's response came with professional pride. 30 years maintaining scales throughout the county teaches one where the vulnerabilities lie. These old pieces have stress points that develop over decades of use. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, then added with apparent casualness, "Inspector Slack mentioned that the hidden cavity was discovered under the crown stamp where the official markings made detection so difficult." The reaction was immediate and telling. Albert Mace straightened with the automatic correction of someone whose expertise had been misrepresented. "Not under the crown stamp," he said, with foundry-trained certainty. "Under the base near the rim. That's where you'd hollow it out to take metal without affecting the balance point. That's how—" He stopped abruptly, colour rising from his collar like spilled ink. The silence that followed was profound. Miss Marple's needles continued their gentle rhythm while she observed the sudden tension that had transformed her sitting room into a theatre of revelation. Inspector Slack leaned forward with the alert attention of someone recognizing a crucial moment. "How very interesting, Mr. Mace," Miss Marple said softly. "I don't believe Inspector Slack mentioned the base to anyone. One imagines that only someone with intimate knowledge of the tampering would know such specific details." Albert's weathered hands moved restlessly, and she noticed the faint, chalky residue that clung to his fingertips. Not the honest dust of groundskeeping, but the telltale traces of whiting paste used to conceal metalwork modifications. His eyes darted toward the window with the desperate calculation of someone whose carefully constructed deception had suddenly collapsed. "But technical knowledge alone wouldn't suffice," Miss Marple continued with relentless gentleness. "The murderer also needed access to artists' materials, specifically the gesso used to conceal the tampering, and they needed a way to misdirect suspicion, perhaps by borrowing distinctive items that would implicate others." Her gaze moved to Lydia Crane, whose administrative composure had begun to fracture under the mounting pressure. The woman's gloved hands tightened on her handbag, and Miss Marple noticed how her eyes avoided looking directly at Albert Mace, as if eye contact might somehow confirm a shared guilt. "The blue hat with its kingfisher feather was rather clever misdirection," Miss Marple observed, "though I suspect it wasn't borrowed so much as commissioned. Someone with access to estate funds might easily purchase such distinctive millinery, then ensure it was seen at crucial moments before being discarded as false evidence." Lydia's breath caught audibly. "That's pure speculation," she managed, but her voice carried the hollow quality of someone whose defences were crumbling. "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed mildly, though the fragment of artist's supply label found beneath the trestle, Selway and Company, artist's colours, Much Benham, seems rather specific. The same establishment where a state business might take one for various purchases, including materials that could serve alternative purposes. The psychological pressure was building with mathematical precision. Albert Mace sat rigid with the knowledge that his technical slip had exposed him, while Lydia Crane struggled to maintain her administrative facade as the web of evidence tightened around both of them. "Collaboration," Miss Marple said gently, "is often more effective than individual effort. A foundryman's technical skills combined with an administrator's resources and access. The scales required months of careful sabotage, while the misdirection demanded someone with authority to move freely throughout the village and estate. Albert's resistance finally crumbled. "She said it was just to pressure him," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of betrayed trust. "Make him understand what his greed was costing people. The widow's account, the way he treated those who couldn't pay, it wasn't right." "But pressure alone proved insufficient," Miss Marple continued with inexorable logic. "When Silas Grimsby continued to prosper despite the tampered scales, when he threatened to expose irregularities in estate accounts, more decisive action became necessary." Lydia Crane's composure shattered completely. "He was going to ruin everything," she said desperately. "The estate, my position, Albert's family, all because he couldn't be satisfied with honest profit. Someone had to stop him." Inspector Slack rose with the satisfied air of someone whose case had finally assembled itself properly. The confession was partial but sufficient, revealing the collaborative nature of a crime that had begun as financial pressure and escalated to murder when subtler methods failed. As the constables led them away, Miss Marple reflected that scales, whether brass or moral, revealed their true nature most clearly when subjected to the precise pressure needed to expose hidden deceptions. The weights had finally balanced, but the cost of that balance would echo through St. Mary Mead for years to come. The afternoon light filtering through the church hall windows seemed to illuminate truth itself as Miss Marple arranged her final revelation with the careful precision that had characterized the entire investigation. Inspector Slack had assembled the key witnesses and participants, understanding that this elderly lady's gentle observations had unravelled a deception of remarkable sophistication and calculated malice. The brass pans from the destroyed scales rested on the table before her, their polished surfaces catching the light like golden witnesses to months of systematic sabotage. Miss Marple's knitting lay beside them, a symbol of the patient, methodical work that had been required to weave together the threads of truth from a tapestry of deliberate deception. "This crime," she began with characteristic mildness, "was remarkable not for its violence but for its patience. Most murders spring from sudden passion or desperate impulse, leaving obvious trails for investigators to follow. This crime, however, was planned and executed with the methodical precision of master craftsmen, which, in fact, it was." She lifted the infamous 2-pound weight with its distinctive crescent scratch, turning it to reveal the base where the tampering had occurred. Mr. Pritchard's examination confirmed what I had begun to suspect. This weight had been deliberately hollowed from beneath, near the rim where the modification would be least detectable. Nearly 2 ounces of brass were removed, then the cavity filled with artist's gesso to maintain the appearance of solid metal. Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional interest. "The technical skill required suggests considerable expertise in metallurgy." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Albert Mace possessed exactly such expertise, learned from his foundryman father, and refined through decades of metalwork. But technical ability alone wouldn't suffice for such elaborate deception. He required resources, access, and most importantly, a collaborator with the social position to move freely throughout the village without arousing suspicion." She paused to observe the faces around her, noting how understanding dawned in their expressions like sunrise over familiar landscape. Lydia Crane provided these essential elements. Her position as estate administrator gave her access to funds for purchasing materials. The gesso came from Selway and Company in Much Benham, bought on the estate account for supposedly legitimate purposes. More significantly, she possessed the social authority to orchestrate the complex misdirection that protected both conspirators. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with satisfaction. The blue hat with the kingfisher feather was particularly clever misdirection. "Precisely," Miss Marple continued. "Lydia purchased that distinctive hat specifically to create false evidence. Young Simon Blake observed her careful positioning during the festival, always maintaining specific angles to the stall, always keeping to shadowed areas. She was studying Silas Grimsby's habits and the crowd patterns, preparing for the final act of their long campaign." Tom Fletcher, released from custody but still pale with shock, spoke quietly. "But why make the weight light instead of heavy?" Wouldn't heavyweights cheat customers more obviously? Miss Marple smiled with gentle approval at his practical question. That was the genius of their method, my dear boy. A lightweight doesn't cheat customers. It cheats the butcher. Over months, Silas received less money than his scales indicated he should, but customers received exactly what they paid for. His accounts wouldn't balance, but he couldn't understand why his profits were declining despite steady business. She set down the weight and lifted a small dish containing the whitish residue. The psychological pressure was intended to drive him toward desperation and eventual bankruptcy. When I first observed this residue in the crescent scratch, I knew we were dealing with deliberate concealment rather than honest wear. Colonel Melchett's military experience provided context for the tactical elements. The murder itself required precise timing and intimate knowledge of Grimsby's behaviour patterns. Albert approached from behind while Silas was examining his precious scales, a daily ritual of checking their balance and cleanliness, Miss Marple explained. The angle of the fatal blow, as Dr. Haydock determined, came from someone familiar with the weapon's weight and balance. Silas died beside the scales he trusted, killed by the very weight that had been systematically destroying his livelihood. Reverend Clement spoke with moral gravity. But surely such elaborate planning suggests premeditation far beyond the heat of passion. Indeed, Miss Marple replied sadly. When financial pressure alone proved insufficient, when Silas began investigating his accounts more carefully and discovered irregularities that threatened Lydia's position, they escalated to murder. The festival provided perfect cover, crowds, distractions, multiple suspects with various motives. She moved to address the planted evidence with characteristic thoroughness. The file discovered in Tom's toolkit, the blue felt fragment at the destroyed scales, even the destruction of the beam itself, all designed to obscure the true method and motive. Albert's foundry knowledge enabled him to weaken the beam at precise stress points over weeks, making the final break appear spontaneous. Inspector Slack had been following the reconstruction with growing appreciation for its complexity. Their expertise ultimately betrayed them. Mace's correction about the tampering location revealed knowledge only the saboteur could possess. Miss Marple nodded gravely. When I deliberately misstated where the cavity was located, Albert corrected me without thinking. Under the base near the rim, he said, with foundry-trained certainty. That moment of professional pride exposed months of careful deception. As the formal proceedings concluded and the conspirators were led away, Miss Marple reflected on the delicate equilibrium that governed village life. Tom Fletcher approached with gratitude shining in his young face, but she waved away his thanks with characteristic modesty. Scales don't lie when they're given honest weights to work with, she told him gently. Your character provided all the evidence needed. Patience and kindness aren't easily counterfeited, particularly under pressure. The evening settled over Saint. Mary Mead with the peaceful contentment of a village where justice had finally been served, though Miss Marple knew that some weights, once added to the scales of human experience, could never be entirely removed. The brass scales had been restored to their proper function, but the moral scales of the community would require considerable time to recover their balance after such systematic corruption of trust and friendship. The afternoon light, filtering through Miss Marple's cottage windows, held the gentle quality of truth finally revealed, though she understood that revelation was merely the beginning of a longer process of healing. Inspector Slack had departed with his prisoners and his satisfied reports, but the village remained to grapple with the more complex task of rebuilding trust that had been systematically undermined over months of calculated deception. Within days, St. Mary Mead began the delicate work of restoration that follows any great disruption to its peaceful rhythms. The harvest festival decorations were quietly removed, their cheerful colours now incongruous with the sombre reality of what had transpired beneath their bright facade. Yet life, Miss Marple observed, possessed a remarkable resilience that manifested itself in small gestures of renewed faith in ordinary goodness. Tom Fletcher found himself the recipient of unexpected kindness from villagers who had been quick to suspect him, but were equally quick to make amends. Mrs. Bantry organised a subscription for his college fees with characteristic efficiency, while Mr. Pritchard offered part-time work that would provide both income and valuable experience in precision measurements. The young man accepted these gestures with the quiet dignity that had marked his character throughout the ordeal, though Miss Marple noticed he still checked his jacket pocket occasionally, reassuring himself that his precious savings book remained safe. The butcher's stall stood empty for now, its wooden frame weathered but structurally sound. The estate had offered Tom the lease, a gesture that carried both practical necessity and moral redemption. Miss Marple watched from her garden as he carefully cleaned and organised the space, his movements betraying the nervous pride of someone given an unexpected second chance at honest enterprise. "He's learning proper techniques from old Patterson in Much Benham, Doctor," Haydock informed her during one of their regular conversations. "The college in Gloucester has agreed to defer his place until next autumn, understanding the circumstances. Meanwhile, he's building a reputation for quality and fairness that should serve him well. The brass scales themselves had been entrusted to a master craftsman in London, their 3 generations of honest service to be restored through modern expertise applied to traditional methods." Miss Marple reflected that the scales, like the village itself, would bear invisible scars from their ordeal, but would emerge stronger for having been properly mended rather than merely patched. Mrs. Pemberton had recovered both her health and her dignity, the latter restored by Tom's quiet generosity, and the former improved by proper nutrition made possible through collective village support. She had become something of a symbol of community resilience, proof that kindness could triumph over calculated cruelty when good people chose to act rather than merely observe. The fate of Albert Mace and Lydia Crane served as a sobering reminder of how ordinary resentments could metastasize into extraordinary evil when nurtured in darkness. Their collaboration had seemed so clever in conception, the foundryman's technical skills married to the administrator's resources and social position, yet had ultimately destroyed both their lives and the man they had sought to ruin. Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the ordinary roots of such extraordinary malice as she tended her late roses in the crisp autumn air. Financial pressure, social resentment, and moral compromise had combined like volatile chemicals, creating an explosive mixture that had devastated multiple lives. Yet the components themselves were disturbingly familiar, the daily struggles and small disappointments that touched every human existence. Simon Blake had remained in the village, his artistic sensibilities apparently finding new depth in documenting the healing process. His sketches of village life now carried a subtle gravitas, capturing not just physical beauty but something of the moral complexity that lay beneath St. Mary Mead's placid surface. Reverend Clement had commissioned him to create a series on honest craftsmanship, perhaps seeking to emphasize positive virtues after such a stark reminder of human fallibility. The investigation had revealed how easily trust could be corrupted when technical expertise was applied to dishonest purposes. The tampered weight, with its hollow core and deceptive surface, would serve as a permanent reminder that appearances could deceive even the most careful observers. Miss Marple understood that the real lesson lay not in the mechanical details of the deception, but in the patient malice that had conceived and executed such elaborate sabotage. As evening shadows lengthened across the village green, she completed her final row of knitting and set the work aside. The pattern was finished, each stitch contributing to a whole that was both beautiful and functional, rather like the investigation itself, she reflected. Individual observations that seemed insignificant in isolation had formed a coherent picture when properly assembled. The scales of justice had finally balanced, though the weights required to achieve that balance had been heavier than anyone might have anticipated. St. Mary Mead would continue its peaceful existence, marked but not broken by the violence that had briefly disrupted its routines. The brass scales would eventually return to measure honest weights for honest customers, their gleaming surfaces reflecting not just morning light, but the renewed trust that made community life possible. In the gathering dusk, Miss Marple offered a quiet prayer for all concerned, the living and the dead, the guilty and the innocent, the corrupted and the redeemed. Human nature, she had long understood, contained both the capacity for extraordinary evil and the resilience to heal from its consequences. The scales would always require careful tending, but they could be trusted to find their balance when given honest weights to work with.